being here. Thank you to the conveners of the presentation, and also thank you to Dr. Ina Vanderbroek for inviting me to participate in this research project. The title of this project is The Ethnobotany of Caribbean Music, focusing on the Greater Antilles. So, popular music is largely unexplored for the botanical content which it holds. And our question was, how are Caribbean musics how are botanical resources represented in Caribbean musics? We hypothesized that the lyrical reference to taxa would shift over time as a reflection of the popularity of different taxa, and that this would indicate societal, ideological, and material changes in Caribbean cultures. We also hypothesized that in expanding the definition of the term religion to include Caribbean spiritualities, it would show a link between those belief systems, traditional ecological and ethnobotanical knowledge, and the celebration of spiritual well-being. The ethnobotany of Caribbean music is more than just the materials used in the construction of musical instruments. It also comprises the way that traditional ethnobotanical and ethnoecological knowledge is transferred both interculturally and intergenerationally. Plants and musics have occupied a central role in ethnographies since the earliest ethnographies of, for example, of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas of the native Taino peoples of the Caribbean. And it has continued to occupy a central place in cultural anthropology and especially in ethnomusicology, where much information of interest to ethnobotanists has been generated. Ethnobotanists have begun to look, since the 70s, have begun to look into the role of the popularization of traditional musics on conservation, focusing on Africa and later on in Brazil. And ethnobotanists have also begun to study the botanical knowledge that is stored within folk song. Ethnobiology proposes that we carry out studies of this information through song. However, Caribbean musics can be divided into two categories: folk music and popular music. The folklorization of traditional musics is a colonial process, taking people's cultures and reducing it to an object for study. In the creation of these archives, there has been unequal access to anthropological material. Similarly, using folk songs, we present research as if culture is a static process. With popular music, we can explore these themes as if culture was a dynamic process. We can also begin to look at the intergenerational and cross-cultural transfer of knowledge between cultural groups. Finally, the knowledge which we explore resides firmly within the public domain. YouTube is an interesting resource, or can be an interesting resource, for ethnobotanical and ethnobiological study. It provides free access, it functions off of user-uploaded content, and it similarly, as you can see all the way at the bottom, it lists views, giving us an idea of the influence of particular songs. To date, the study has collected 333 songs and has analyzed the botanical content of 270 of them. This provides the basis for an observational study, a comparative analysis of Caribbean musics. In this comparative analysis, we can begin to detect patterns in the ethnobotany of popular musics of the Caribbean. First, that they function as cultural indicators, and that the plants which are listed in regional musics are usually highly integrated or highly important to those cultural belief systems. Within Caribbean musics, we saw a high incidence of references to food and references to medicine, and also references to spirituality. However, it's hard to unpack and untie these categories, as in many songs, multiple themes were commented on. And so failing to consider the interconnectedness of these patterns is a disservice to communities which are being studied. The Caribbean has a long history of migration and has been built off of a long history of migration. And so the first song is not from the Antilles. It's from mainland Guyana, but has been extremely influential in the music of the Caribbean region. The first song listed here is West Indian Weed Woman by Bill Rogers, and it was a shanto, it was a song from the shanto musical genre of Guyana that was released in the 1930s and that had amazing popularity throughout the Caribbean. Harry Belafonte, American-born, would later produce his own version of West Indian Weed Woman. Similarly, a Jamaican-born Count Lasher would make his own version entitled The Weed, aka Man Piaba. The interesting thing that can be noted here is that as these songs travel between cultures, there's a loss of biodiversity and biocultural diversity. The Guyanese song begins with 150 taxa, and Harry Belafonte's song mentions only 8 taxa, whereas still in Jamaica, very close to Guyana, 56 taxa are mentioned within Caribbean songs. The other thing, I would have really liked to pack my presentation with a bunch of music so that you all could have listened to these examples, but there was a fear of, obviously, of running over. So West Indian Weed Woman narrates the adventure of a man through a market, and he's looking for food and he encounters upon a market woman, but she's selling food, but that's not all she's selling. She's also selling medicinal herbs. And so West Indian Weed Woman is really a list song listing all the plants that the herb woman is selling. And while food plants are mentioned, the major focus is on the spiritual connotation of the herbs used within Jamaican healing practices. As we move to Woman Piaba, Man Piaba, there is more of a focus on the sexual connotations implied by the herbs Woman Piaba and Man Piaba. Harry Belafonte, one of the major differences is that his music was to an international crowd, and it was largely based in New York City. He relied heavily on his childhood traveling to the Caribbean and traveling to Jamaica as an influence in his musical practice. However, the music was largely produced for an American audience. Another instance of musical migrations and transfer of TEEK can be seen in El Yerbero by Celia Cruz. Produced in 1956, this was also a very influential record. And while it only mentions 7 taxa, the focus is specifically on medicinal and spiritual plants. It was covered various times. As we can see, the cover by Charlie Palmieri in New York City lists only 2 taxa. Whereas Yerbero by Machito, also in New York City, but of Cuban descent like Celia Cruz, mentions 6 taxa. But ironically, as we enter into the beginning of the special period in Cuba, El Yerbero by Los Muñequitos mentions only 3 taxa. However, things are obviously changing in Cuba because the song Nuevo Pregones, Timbelaye, also roughly based on El Yerbero, mentions 13 taxa. And while it may mention 13 taxa, there is another shift within the thematic content of the music. And so while it also features, or while its focus is medicinal and spiritual plants, there's an introduction here, one of moringa. And so moringa and the vernacular name for moringa is not common to Cuba and represents the influence of other Caribbean islands. Taken together, that means that these musics cannot be irreduced to their geographic locations of origin. Furthermore, the names that are encoded within Caribbean songs there is evidence for the role of linguistic affiliation in the transfer of these cultural musics between different Caribbean states. And so there is a high incidence of music and songs which is transferred over from Jamaica to Trinidad, likely from Cuba to Puerto Rico. Breaking this trend, there's also been music that transfers across linguistic barriers, such as from Haiti into the Dominican Republic. However, sorry, I had a momentary. However, in order to fully identify these plants and these songs, which are, the songs never list the plants by their specific epithet or by their genus and epithet. And so these songs will require, or rather vernacular names are the property of the local peoples who use them. And these songs will require in-field validation of the plants used in order to truly know which ones they refer to. And here's Harry Belafonte singing Deo. Similarly, songs which are known for their botanical content, such as the banana boat, mention very little text, showing the interaction of botanical themes within the lives of Caribbean people. The song was based off of the work songs of Jamaican banana in the morning come, and mentions banana not one bit. However, touches on the colonial aspects of life in Jamaica. Thank you. Questions or comments?
Thank you for the question. Thank you very much for this amazing piece of research. I would like to project this in the future. We have a lot of discussions around the world about how to reinstill, revitalize local ecological knowledge, especially in the youngest generation. Do you feel music, considering also the consumption of music in social media, could be one of the instruments, or it's probably we go too far?
No, I think that music, is an especially poignant way in which to carry out issues of conservation. UNESCO has, said that cultural values are important to biocultural diversity. And similarly, the use and the representation of plants within these Caribbean musics, as I mentioned earlier, as I tried to mention earlier, are culturally indicative. So what I meant by that is that plants like ackee, plants like framboyang, they represent not only the plants, but the cultures of people in the Caribbean. They're synonymous, they're literally synonymous with the cultures of the Caribbean.
Question?
Historically, drums were made from mahogany within the Caribbean. That was an adaptation off of a wood that they used in Africa. However, with CITES, there's less use of mahogany for the creation of these drums, and so they've switched to materials such as cedrela. That being said, in the origin of Caribbean musics, one of the things that happened was that drums were not allowed to be played. You know, drums were a manner through which African peoples could communicate, especially those who had tonal languages. And so Caribbean peoples generally made do with what materials they could find around. And that is the invention of literally, I guess, the conga drum from my first slide. You know, these conga drums were originally used to store sugar to transfer them to the New World as part of the tripartite trade. But slaves took them, enslaved peoples took them and repurposed them for their own uses. So I didn't look at folk songs. I should have, you know, also led with the fact that I am a traditional performer of Caribbean music. You know, so for me, there are no, you know, there's no folk. You know, it's a living, breathing tradition. You know, and that's also why there was a focus on market vendor songs, because while it also has been folklorized within Jamaica, within the Caribbean, this represents a living, breathing tradition, not only of music, but of traditional ecological and ethnobotanical awareness and knowledge.
Question?
You mentioned that songs were the public domain. I want to know what you think about that, that limits the link between these materials and knowledge on your communities. If there would be other rights to assert limited songs.
For the continuation of this study to go on, you know, one of the issues in analyzing themes is that, you know, it is still largely an etic discussion and requires more, you know, from the community on their opinions of the ways that traditional ecological and ethnobotanical knowledge are encoded in these songs. You know, the issue of, or with being in public domain, you know, they could have gotten published even if those knowledge and secrets if the cultures wanted to keep them hidden. And similarly, there's much within popular musics that, you know, folk that figure as double entendre, or they reference, you know, things that are known within the culture, but not well known outside of it. So that being said, it's going to require the communities from which that produce these musics to fully analyze this data set.
Yes. So I have the opportunity years ago, like this workshop with folk music, which is like regional things, I love from all the ranges. What an amazing experience. But when you show like the quality data and songs that are included in food, for example, have you encountered any loss of information, like you as a musician? I mean, I've encountered that myself. You do have great variety of ways, great variety of like general tutorials, but at the end, it is not the same when you go to the actual place. Because music tells a story. Music, like the way you make an instrument, for them is cultural and some stories are rich when you make a flute or drum. So how do you manage that lack of maybe information that because that is such something that project
With actually being involved and integrated with the communities of study. You know, I'm of Puerto Rican, African American, and Trinidadian descent, but I also live in a multi-ethnic neighborhood. And besides that, I'm also collaborating with researchers, in countries of origin and trying to expand the network of collaborators to include researchers in Haiti, researchers in the Bahamas.
Yes.
As a musician, do you compose songs with the botanical content, and how many species do they contain?
I have not gotten yet to, the Bill Rogers level, but ironically, one of the traditional songs or the ritual songs of the Cuban people, which has been folklorized to a certain extent, there are commercial recordings of it, is the major ritual for Afro-Cubans involves singing to the plants. And so each plant has a particular song to be used within the initiation ceremonies.
Our last question, I think.
Tell us that 95% interest in animals, 95% interest in plants. Have you compared animals in song versus plants in song?
Well,
Expect that they could think of animals in song.
this study is based off of a study that looked at the ethnobiological, so looking at both animals and plants. The focus of this study, however, was simply to look at botanical species. There is an article called Salsa con Coco, and that article mentions a bunch of animal species which are mentioned in Caribbean songs, or rather Caribbean dance musics. Only the focus is not just the Greater Antilles, but also encompasses Central America and the northern part of South America.
My question was more data methodology. I love that you're looking at YouTube. YouTube is a fantastic place to look for people who, especially who are looking into new genres of music. So it might be local youth who are interested in Caribbean music, because I've had some students who are Caribbean and have shown me YouTube channels of Caribbean music and how they really like it and tried to share with me that way. But also I look at other genres of music like K-pop and J-pop and Mandopop as it moves around the world. And the comment section of YouTube is amazing. I don't know if you really pull down the comment section. There's so much data there, and there's so much cultural knowledge exchange of explaining what that euphemism was, or explaining what that means. And I'm wondering do you see that communication and that being a way of knowledge transfer for younger people?
Yes, I do. And, particularly there has been research on YouTube on the way that YouTube videos circulate. And largely they circulate in your social circles based off of algorithms that are based on your social circles. And similarly, as you mentioned, the comments are filled with all of this data, on themes, on content within the music, on how, Jamaicans or Puerto Ricans actually interpret the music themselves.
It's time stamps. You can see the time zones. You can tell when the Russians wake up. You can tell when South America is awake, right? When it's a new drop. And it's and the data is beautiful because again, you have all these time stamps and they're clustered. I'm just thinking, I keep staring at it going, if I get a big enough computer program, the salient scores would be amazing. So I wondered in seeing some other students do that, if that was something you were looking into. It'd be massive. There's so many of them.
And that's also, part of the issue though, is that there are, an extremely large data, and it's unequal though. There's a large amount of data for certain songs, but for other, cultures or other geographic areas who may not have the same level of internet access or the same level of infrastructure, there's less availability of music on YouTube. And so that was one of the limitations in finding music for like Haiti or, the Bahamas or.
And because the YouTube algorithm targets where you are and feeds you different things. So you have to look at like VPN. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.